Welcome to You Have My Sword. We are back. It's season 2, and I've been hard at work trying to work a cum joke into every episode. I am so sorry to my family if you are listening to this. Anyways, today we are talking about queens, in particular, the ladies of the Valar. So let's talk about it. Before we jump into it, I want to answer a quick question someone wrote in. You guys send me a ton of questions, which is great, and I keep track of them for future Q&A episodes, which I'll still be doing each season. But I'd like to answer one listener question per episode to kind of grease the wheels here. So please, if you have any questions or want to share a story about anything regarding Tolkien's work, no matter what the story is, send them to me. You can send them in via the contact form at youhavemyswordpodcast.com, or you can DM me on Instagram or Twitter on the You Have My Sword accounts. Anonymous writes, asking, does Sauron know he is evil? This is such a fun question and is something worth asking in regards to any big bad in any form of media, right? The short answer, in my opinion, is no. I don't think Sauron views himself as evil so much as he truly feels he knows what's best for the world. And there is context to kind of back this up. Some antagonists can be incredibly compelling where you can almost see where they're coming from. A good example of this is Killmonger from Black Panther, who has moral, ethical, and emotional reasons for enacting his agenda. Sauron, I would say, is not incredibly compelling. He doesn't seem to have any moral or ethical reasons outside of he simply feels ownership to Middle-earth and feels he knows what's best for Middle-earth, which is order, except order, by his definition, is essentially brutality. Originally, Sauron did at one point have a relatively sincere notion that Middle-earth needed ordering, that he, for whatever reason, was the best qualified being around to do the job, and that everyone would be happy and grateful to him after his wise administration had brought harmony and wealth to the world. Gradually, likely without Sauron himself even noticing it, the original idealism faded. It quickly devolved into simply having his will become his sole goal, and no other moral standard than his own will existed anymore. Anything that furthered his power and his purposes would be good, anything obstructing them would be bad. So, while perhaps in a warped way he started out with good intentions, by his standards, it quickly decomposed into greed and corruption, which, as we know, is an incredibly consistent theme in Middle-earth. So I hope this answered your question, and thank you for writing in. Let's talk about the fucking queens of the Valar, baby. Let's do a quick refresher on whom's the fuck the Valar are. The Valar were the 14 Ainur who, after being molded of Eru's thought, entered Arda after its creation to give order to the world. They were essentially the gods of Arda, each of which taking responsibility for a specific domain, much like mythological figures. They had helped to begin the shaping of Arda through the music of Ilúvatar and often referred to one another as brother or sister. Each of the Ainur had added his or own part to the music creating the world incarnate, except for Melkor, who at the time was counted as the strongest of them and didn't do fuck all. His vision of what Arda should have been differed from Ilúvatar's, which led to his banishment and great rebellion that would cause most of the drama in the world of Arda. Big fallen angel edgelord vibes here. So let's talk about the queens of the Valar, the women gods of the Ainur. We'll start with Varda. Varda was the most beautiful of all the Valar, and her beauty was said to be beyond the description of men and elves, for her face radiates the light of Eru Ilúvatar. Unsurprisingly, the province over which she ruled was light, to the extent where it was said that in light is her power and her joy. Even before Melkor first began to create his discord, Varda knew his mind well and rejected him because of it, and was always his enemy from that moment on. Like, this is a big friend-zoned situation here, right? As a result of this, Melkor also hated Varda the most out of the Valar and feared her more than all others whom Eru had created. I feel like we all know this guy, right? Varda had come to Arda with her husband, Manwë, and the other Valar in the beginning of days. She aided Manwë in the rule of Arda and watching of Middle-earth. She made the stars, filled the lamps of the Valar with light, collected the dew of the two trees in her wells, fashioned the newer stars and constellations in preparation for the awakening of the elves, hollowed the Silmarils, established the courses of what would become the sun and moon, and set the star of Arendelle in the sky. So this bitch was busy. She was up to shit. Because of her creation of the stars, the elves of Middle-earth revere and love her the most out of the Valar. They even gave her the nickname Elbereth, invoke her name in times where they require aid, and sing her praises whenever the stars rise. It was also said that when Manwë sits beside her upon their throne on the holy mountain, that she was able to hear more clearly than any other ears the prayers and laments of those in need from the furthest east even unto the west. At times she would answer the prayers of not only elves, but also those of other races. For example, during the War of the Ring, she aided Sam through the Phial of Galadriel, which contained the light of Arendelle, during his struggle against Shelob. If you want more context here, we did an episode on the Phial of Galadriel in Season 1. Next, let's talk about Esti. Esti's position within the Valar was best described as the Vala that was responsible for healing the hurt or weary. Esti lived with her husband Irmo in Lorien. She did not walk by day, instead she slept upon the island of the tree-shadowed Lake of Lorelin. All those who dwelt in Valinor drew refreshment from the fountains of Esti and Irmo in Lorien. The Valar themselves often came to the fountains and would find easing and reposing there from the burdens of Arda. Melian had formerly served both Esti and Vana. She dwelt long in Lorien, tending to the trees that flowered in the gardens of Lorien before departing for Middle-earth. Melian, for context, is the mother of Luthien from the story of Beren and Luthien. It was said that Esti did not attend the councils of the Valar, thus she was not reckoned among the Valir, which is a term used when referring to the queens of the Valar, and she was counted instead as the chief of the Maiar. For context, Maiar, like Valar, did not array themselves in a fixed form but could freely change shape. Our boy Gandalf was of the Maiar and walked among the peoples of Middle-earth in an uncertain form for many years before being sent on the errand by the Valar as one of the Istari. The Istari being the wizards we know as Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast, and the two mysterious blue wizards. So that's some interesting shit right there. Up next, let's talk about Nessa. Of the Vala, it is said that Nessa was ranked the least among them. I'm not quite sure what this means, but she apparently spent her free time unburdened from being important, being fast as fuck instead. She was notable for her speed. She was described as being fast as an arrow in movement and was often called Nessa the Swift. She was lithe and swift of foot, and she loved swift creatures such as deer. Deer followed her wherever she went, even into the wild regions of Aman. Nessa could outrun the deer with great speed. Before the destruction of the Isle of Almarin, the first dwelling of the Valar, Nessa delighted in dancing. She would often dance on the green grass of Almarin and later in Valinor on never-fading green lawns. As the Valar had finished with their labors in the creation of Arda, King Manwë ordained a great feast on Almarin. The Valar were gathered upon Almarin during the spring of Arda, and it was sung that Nessa wedded Tulkas here. Her sister-in-law, Vana, wife of Oromi, robed Nessa with her flowers. Nessa danced before the Valar upon the grass of Almarin. I'm sure she did some sort of like ethereal elven dance, but in my head canon, she's on some like Megan Thee Stallion shit, for real. The dwelling of Nessa and Tulkas was said to be full of mirth and revelry, for his warriors played and rivaled one another there, training each other and enjoying feasts in the evening. At times, Nessa would bear goblets of wine and cooling drinks among the champions of her husband. Real wifey shit. After the flight of the Noldor to Middle-earth, Nessa, along with the other Valar, desired ease and peace as in the ancient days of Valinor. They wished not for the rumor of Melkor, nor for the murmurs of the Noldor to ever come again among them and disturb their happiness. As a result, most of the Valar clamored for the concealment of their land, hence the hiding of Valinor. So this is why they were so secretive about hiding their lands, and why any other race coming to their lands was like a big no-no. They were really trying to avoid Melkor's drama, and then subsequently, later on, Sauron's drama. Next, we have Nienna. Nienna brings us some real sad girl hours to Middle-earth. Her name literally means weeping, or she who weeps, and she was the Valar who was responsible for the mercy and grief spread across Arda. She was the sister of Mandos and Ermo and had no spouse. Her part in the music of the Ainur was one of deep sadness, from which grief entered the world at its beginning. She had dominion over the halls of Nienna, which were on the western edge of Valinor, looking over the sea. Nienna was concerned with mourning, and she pitied the suffering of others, especially the marring of Arda by Melkor. Yet the lesson of Nienna is not of endless grief, but rather of pity, hope, and the endurance of the spirit. Nienna dwelt in far western Valinor near Mandos, and she seldom left. Her windows looked out beyond the walls of the night. So she lived in relative isolation and was happy to do so. During the creation of the two trees, she watered the mound with her own tears. The pity of Nienna is most clearly seen in her support for Melkor when he sued for the pardon of the Valar. Though she spent her time in the world mourning for the destruction he had wreaked in Arda, when he sued for release after his 3 ages of captivity, Nienna actually spoke on his behalf. After the flight of the Noldor, Nienna mourned for the destruction of the two trees, and her tears brought healing but could not heal the mortal wounds. Thus, the trees brought forth their last flower and their last fruit, and were made into the sun and moon. Gandalf, in fact, was Nienna's greatest pupil among all the others who dwelt in the halls of Nienna. She taught him pity and many other things before he was chosen as the second wizard sent to lead the people of Middle-earth into standing against Sauron. That's why my man's stays on top. He's powerful, he's sensitive, he's introspective, he just fucking gets it. Can you guys tell that I am an absolute Gandalf stan? I love him. Now, all that is known about Nienna's appearance is that she wore a gray hood. Given that Gandalf was her greatest student, his being clothed in gray may have been a mark of respect to his teacher. How cool is that? Next up, ya girl, Yavanna. Yavanna was responsible for the growth of all fruits and growing of anything in Arda. She was also called Kementari, which means Queen of the Earth. She resided in the pastures of Yavanna in the south of Valinor. Beginning in the years of the lamp during the spring of Arda, she planted and caused to grow the first growing things of the world. Trees, plants, fruit, whatever, which she had long prepared. So her whole deal is she sat down and mapped out what trees and fruit and anything that grew from the earth was going to look like. At first, just as every other thing in the world that the Valar nurtured and cared for, these things prospered and thrived for a time. Melkor, however, had his own plans, and they involved taking the world from his brethren and ruling it for himself, for he thought he knew a better way. From his great fortress of Autumno in the far north, he sent forth his poisons into the veins of the world, blighting the spring of Arda. Then the things of Yavanna fell sick and rotted, and not soon after is when Melkor assaulted and destroyed the two lamps, thus breaking the world. Afterwards, the Valar relocated to the continent of Aman, where they created the two trees. The only light in the world at this time was from the two trees. Middle-earth was left in darkness, and the living things that survived were put into a great sleep by Yavanna until the rise of the sun and the moon many thousands of years later. After Ilúvatar allowed Aule's creations, the dwarves, to survive, Yavanna feared that they would cut down all the trees in Middle-earth. Eru answered her plea by creating the Ents to protect and shepherd the trees. So this is interesting. So that's how the Ents came to be, because of Yavanna's weird vibe towards the dwarves, right? But yeah, the Ents came to be to kind of be a protector of the trees in Middle-earth during a time of darkness. After the destruction of the two trees, Yavanna examined their remains and told the other Valar that if she could use the light of the Silmarils, she could heal them. This light was denied by the will of Feanor, which is so fucked up of him, honestly. Doing what she could, she worked with Nienna, and they managed to bring forth one silver flower from Telperion and one golden fruit from Lorelin. She gave these to her husband, Aule, who fashioned vessels for them and thus created the moon and the sun. So we go from Yavanna now to Vana. Vana, whose name means beautiful one, was responsible for preserving the youth made for all life in Arda. Vana was considered the sixth in importance. I don't know what this hierarchy is or this scale of like who's more important than who, because it seems like everyone's job is pretty important, but there does seem to be some kind of weird hierarchy within the Valar, and it's interesting kind of to see who they view as more important amongst, their brothers and sisters. Vana was the younger sister of Yavanna, and in her dwelling she had gardens filled with golden flowers. Like her sister, the province of Vana was growing things of the world, and she was a lover of nature. Vana had influence with the flora and fauna of Middle-earth, and she was associated especially with flowers. Thus, Vana was also known as the Queen of the Flowers. It was said that when the Valar Tulkas and Nessa were wedded on the Isle of Elmerin, the first dwelling of the Valar, Vana robed her sister-in-law with her flowers. A little throwback to what I just said roughly 6 minutes ago, I guess. In the days of the two trees of Valinor, Arian of the Maiar had served Vana by tending to the golden flowers of her gardens, watering them with bright dews from Lorelin. After the darkening of Valinor and the flight of the Noldor to Middle-earth, most of the Valar were glad to have their ancient peace back, wishing for neither Melkor and his violence nor the murmur of the restless Noldor to ever come upon them again. Therefore, they clamored for the concealment of their land in Aman. It was said that that Vana was the one among them leading this charge, I guess you could say. So according to the Silmarillion, all flowers spring as Vana passes and opens if she glances upon them, and all birds sing at her coming. So Vana was on some like real Snow White shit, right? Vana robed herself in flowers, and it was said that her hair was golden in color. Vana had the beauty of both heaven and earth upon her face and in all her works. Like Nessa, Vana also sang and danced along with her maidens. How nice. Last but not least, we have Ver. Ver, whose name means weaver, was counted among the queens of the Valar, though she was not as great in power or prestige as some. Honestly, this ranking system has me fucked up, y'all. I don't like this shit one bit, because it really truly sounds like all these girls pulled their weight, right? Anyways, her storied webs covered the halls of Mandos, where she apparently lived with Mandos, her husband. So that is some real power couple shit, because Mandos is very important and the halls of Mandos is very important. With the passage of time and its many ages, her woven tapestries expanded and clothed all the walls of the halls of the dead. There isn't much said about her, which is odd since I do find her particular role to be the most fascinating, weaving the stories of the world and living in the Hall of Mandos, which is essentially purgatory, where you are judged, and if you are deemed worthy, you are returned back to the world. This is where Gandalf goes when he dies fighting the Balrog and is judged quite obviously worthy to return to the world, and returns as Gandalf the White in the sickest, crispiest fit you've ever seen. And that's really it for her. There isn't much said about her, which is a bummer because I did actually find her the most interesting. I think there is something really cool about her being the weaver and kind of keeping history and weaving it in a way that also has a physical incarnation. But anyways, those are our queens of the Valar. Something else to consider now that you've been introduced to the ladies of the Valar is that Tolkien is said to have paid homage to Greek mythology, in particular the Greek pantheon, due to each and every one of the Valar had a specific realm within the world that was at his or her command, right? Much as the Greek gods in ancient myths. Tolkien wanted to create a mythology for his world, and the Greek model fit the bill perfectly. For those that don't know, Tolkien's initial big writing project was to create a mythology for England, which he quickly abandoned to work on The Hobbit and then Lord of the Rings. But he was able to create a mythology within these worlds that he created, scratching his initial itch, right? With this in mind, Manwë, king of the Valar, is most akin to Zeus, the king of the Greek gods. In the same manner, Varda, as the wife of Manwë, as well as the true queen of the Valar, is the equivalent of Hera, the wife of Zeus and queen of the Greek gods. Due to her being the most beautiful and lovable of the Valar, she was also seen to be most akin to Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love and beauty. Anyways, mythology is so fun. In fact, I implore you to listen to one of my favorite podcasts called Let's Talk About Myths, Baby. She is an inspiration and an absolute beast when it comes to solo podcasting. Her podcast is one of my favorites, and having marathoned her podcast through 2020 has buffed a lot of my mythology knowledge in a huge way. As someone obsessed with history, the fantasy element of history really fucking hits for me. So please check her out. And with that, we end our first episode of season 2. It feels great to be back, and thank you for returning to listen. Your support means so much to me. Please visit youhavemyswordpodcast.com for links to all socials, and you can find us over at Patreon under You Have My Sword if you'd like to support. I've kind of restructured the Patreon a bit to make it a little simpler. It helps make it feasible for me to keep doing this podcast, which is no small task, and it also grants you access to my Discord, which is a hellscape. Again, please feel free to write in with anything you think could be fun to read on the show. I want to read more stuff from you guys in every episode, and as you've likely gleaned by now, we have fun. There's no rules, there's no limits, just pure high fantasy chaos. Thank you guys, and as always, you have my sword.
Edgeworks Nebula.